Understanding some basic composition techniques and then applying them when you photograph subjects can make a dramatic difference in the quality of your images. We're going to discuss and illustrate 5 of these techniques. My hope is that you will start using them in every image you create. If you learn this well, you will never again see the world in quite the same way. Here are the 5 techniques. 4 of them, the rule of thirds, leading lines, repetition, and simple backgrounds, can be done simply by the way you arrange your subject or yourself when you're taking a picture. Depth of field is a little harder. Sometimes it happens automatically, but often you will need some control over your camera settings to create these kind of effects. Here is the first image. This is a monochromatic image, all shades of black and gray. I chose this image to illustrate the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds requires you to either turn the grid on your camera app or visualize the image divided into 9 squares. Any place you see one of the 4 intersection points is a good place to put the focal point of your image. A focal point is the most important bit of your image, in this case the trash can opening. In general, you will rarely want to center your subject in the frame. You should have it facing into the space that comprises the majority of the frame and not rushing out of the edge of the frame. Here is another example. You can see that the crack between the doors is an interesting part of the picture, partly because it's mysterious and you kind of want to see what's back there, but also because the black line is a good contrast with the lighter wooden surfaces that draw your eye. You may notice that this looks more like the rule of 5/8 instead of the rule of thirds, but the principle is the same. The focal point is definitely offset from the center. Here is another one. The spike is driven into the tree trunk right at the 3rd mark. While I might wish it was easier to see the spike, contrast, it is a nice image. You note that the point of the spike is angled toward the interior of the image, so it draws your eye in instead of out. Here is another example. The calculator is mostly in the upper right quadrant, so this image does use the rule of thirds. But the leading lines are mostly angles. You see this in the spine of the book, the edge and margin of the paper, the angle of the calculator, and the keys. This image moves into a new technique. You can see the focal point of the image, in my opinion, is where your eye settles. My eye settles at the top right, where the keyboard ends. This image was actually taken on the McMurray campus in one of the practice rooms. Once you have the rule of thirds down, you can start looking at other ways to add interest and depth to your image. Let's look at leading lines. This image has a lot of leading lines. The horizontal lines created by every key on the keyboard comprise one set of leading lines. The very strong lines that are created by the edges of the black keys and then again with the edges of the white keys create more. Because the black background swallows up everything else, there are not a lot of distractions in this image. There are leading lines here also. The edge of the sidewalk, the stairway, the railings, the slope of the grass, the vertical striations on the back wall. How about this? We've mostly been looking at straight lines and angles, but curves can be very interesting as well. Notice how your eye moves from the triangles in the foreground of the image closest to you and tracks around the curve following the lanes and ends with the stadium seats at the top left. The idea that things closer to you are larger and that things further away from you are smaller can be used deliberately to increase a sense of scale or distance. Leading lines. Bicycle rack. Notice the contrast provided by the curve in the background, the cable, and the lot. Do you think this image would have been stronger if it had been presented as a true vertical instead of canted? This is a sculpture in the courtyard of our campus center. Very strong curves. The color captured in this image is also very beautiful. More leading lines. Architectural images are often very powerful. When you can combine them with something like the riot of ivy, the contrast is enhanced. There are a lot of leading lines here. Can you count them all? This one is pretty simple, but the stairs provide a lot of strong lines both across each step and marching up the wall. The banister emphasizes the upward movement. The texture in this image also adds to the effect. You have concrete, stucco, pebble, and metal. The stains on the wall and on the concrete add more interest. Now let's segue to the next topic, which is repetition. Having one shape, one color, or a series of similar lines repeated numerous times can create interest in an image. In this case, the steps are repeated. This might lead your eye up and out or down and in. Here is another example. We have a series of teepees here, all with similar shapes. Your eye probably starts with the large white teepee in the left corner and moves around to the smaller brown, white, and blue teepee at the very right. Notice the use of vanishing points. The largest white teepee is closest to us, and further away the teepees get, the smaller they get. Repetition is found in the shapes of the teepees and the poles used to erect them. There's not so much repetition in the colors of the teepees. You saw this image before when we examined repetition. This time, focus on the leading lines. They move to the vanishing point. Here is another example of repetition, a container of pumpkins. The repetition is in shape. They are all similarly shaped, and there's some repetition in color, shades of orange. There are a couple of white pumpkins in there to provide some contrast. Here is another image where repetition is important. This time the subjects are in the center, but it still works. The marine shorts, the similar denim skirts, the hairstyles, and the posture all contribute to the repetition. To a lesser degree, the football players carry out the theme, the color, and provide some repetition of their own. This is another architectural image. Where's the repetition here? The triangles across the ceiling, the chairs, the tables. Do you see how the unique elements like the pillar, the plant, and the blank space in the lower right all approximate the rule of thirds? In this image, you get repetition, leading lines, and vanishing points. See how the background looks so small and far away, and the nearest hurdle looks so big and close? I have always loved this photo. Lines, action, repetition, color. We've got it all. More leading lines. Repetition. This is a very vertical set of lines unless you look at the shelf, and that one is a strong horizontal. You might be forgiven if you look at this and yelled, rule of thirds, meaning the hole on the top on the left, or repetition for all the little holes that fill the whole image, or even lines, because there is a quadrant outlined at the top that intersects at the hole where the umbrella pole should go. But we're moving now into a different technique, which is depth of field. Look for the part of the image that's very sharp and focused. Look for the parts that are starting to get fuzzy. Being able to control which part of your image is sharp and which part fades out into blur is another technique. So in this image, the central part is in sharp focus, but the parts nearest to you and furthest away from you are starting to blur. Sometimes you can see a square on your camera viewfinder. This usually indicates the part of the image that will be in the sharpest focus. Cameras can keep a certain distance from the focal point in sharp focus, but the further you get from that point, whether closer to you or further away, the image begins to blur. The amount of light the lens has to work with will also influence the quality of your image. If the subjects in your image, both near and far, are in focus, then you have what's called a deep depth of field. If only a narrow slice of the image is in focus and all the rest is blurry, as in this image, you have what's called a shallow depth of field. Generally speaking, your f number can help you control this. Low f numbers on your camera create images with shallow depths of field. The higher the number, the deeper the field. You can find apps for your cell phone camera that let you control some of this, but it will never be quite the same thing as using a digital SLR camera with full manual controls. Here you see an image where the sharp focus is in the foreground, but as you look to the background, the trees and the other scenery are quite blurred. Here is another example. Sharp focus on the handlebars in the foreground, but the focus softens as the object gets further away. Notice too the leading lines created by the handlebar and the brake handle. People often use shallow depth of field to produce a simple background. You can do a lot by moving yourself or your camera. The best thing you can do is get in close. This does two things. It focuses on the subject that is most interesting, and it minimizes the trash, the cars, or the fences in the background. Other than simply getting in close, alter your position. You could go somewhere else so that the background is more conducive to your shot. You can shoot from below or from above. The best thing you could do is be aware. People tend to focus on their subject, and they might not even see all the clutter that competes with the subject because they're so busy looking at the thing they want to photograph. In a garden, you might be so focused on a particular flower that you never see the weeds, the burned leaves, the candy wrappers, or other objects that might be in your frame. The camera will pick up everything in the frame unless you manipulate the depth of field. So it's best to watch for these things as you're composing your image and take the time to set up a good shot. Here is an example. This image was taken near a busy street. You can see that there is a highline in the background, but by getting in close and letting the teepee fill the frame, we didn't get the parking lot, the busy street, the crowd standing around the grassy area, or the rest of the highlines that were visible from where the photographer was standing. The blue sky does a great job of providing a simple background. Here is another one. The darkness creates the simple background. The shadow obscures the court, the banners, the lights, the stadium seating. It's hard to get a shot like this without special lighting equipment. We've seen this one before. Depth of field softens the busy background. The photographer also got in close so that the reflector on the bike gets the attention, not the parking lot. And you can see too that there are not many cars in the lot. Had the lot been full, this image would have suffered. Planning when you take your images can make a difference. Choose times when there's less congestion. Let's review. Rule of thirds. The subject or focal point should not be in the center of the photo. Possibilities: top right, top left, bottom right, or bottom left. Leading lines. Leading lines are strong lines or curves. They may be parallel or opposing. Leading lines are often combined with other techniques. Repetition is where your photograph contains more than one element with strong similarity. Your scale may be controlled by distance, by using the vanishing point, or including various sizes within the groupings of subjects. Depth of field is created by selectively controlling your focus. The focal point is sharp. The foreground and/or the background is soft. This technique is sometimes used to simplify backgrounds. The important point of a simple background is do not let your background compete with your subject. Zoom in or otherwise tighten the composition. Use depth of field to blur the background. Move to a better location, or use shadows, but this one is hard. In addition to these 5 techniques, the rule of thirds, leading lines, repetition, depth of field, and simple backgrounds, you should always strive for excellent lighting and good focus. Think about whether your image is better with a portrait, vertical, or landscape, horizontal orientation. Not all images need to be colorful. Some can be very effective with only a few colors, but all of your images will be better with good, saturated colors. Consistent use of all these techniques and really studying your frame in the viewfinder prior to taking that shot, making whatever adjustments are required, will go a long, long way toward making the majority of your shots social media worthy.